divorced, how much were they suffering before?
Well, this is, it's difficult to determine that because, of course, we may hear about certain cases. We don't know how general those types of cases were. The idea that women were the property of their husbands and had absolutely no rights within marriage is a common feminist myth. And it's actually quite difficult. It's difficult to find books that actually lay out the specific laws that governed marriage over the centuries when they changed. In my research, I have certainly found that feminist
Mhm,
reformers were active throughout the 19th century and were taken very seriously by
mhm.
all male governments in changing laws in order to protect women's rights, their right to own property, their rights in divorce,
Mm,
their rights in child custody settlements. And so it simply isn't true that male politicians and men in general didn't
right.
care about women's well-being in marriage. Men always had in marriage a primary responsibility to take care of women's, to take care of them financially. Even if the woman left the husband, he was still responsible for her. He was responsible for all her debts. Many men went to debtors' prisons because they couldn't pay their
Mhm.
wife's debts in the 19th century and earlier. So the idea that
Right,
women bore the entire burden of marriage is simply not true. Many men
right.
bore a terrible burden as well. And there's a fascinating book on this subject by a man named Ernest
Mhm,
Belfort Bax, Bax. He's actually written 2 books and many articles on the position of men in 19th century British society. He was a barrister. He saw many, many, many legal cases involving husbands and wives and accusations of one against the other. And he wrote a book. He was also a journalist. And he wrote a book in 1896 called The Legal Subjection of Men. It was a response to a book by John Stuart Mill, which was published in 1869, in which John Stuart Mill argued that women were unjustly barred from many areas of society and that
mhm,
they should be granted many more rights and freedoms. So Bax was responding to Mill, and his argument was that, in fact, yes, there was a bias in law, but it wasn't, as everybody seemed to believe, a bias against women. He believed that there was a bias in law against men, both within marriage and in the society
mhm.
generally. And it is a really, really fascinating book. He talks about how many women had, they were exempt from many laws. They weren't prosecuted for many types of crimes that men were prosecuted for. He talked about the fact that if a woman killed her husband, she would very
Mhm.
rarely be convicted of murder because the man's character would immediately be put on trial. He would be depicted as an abusive person who actually deserved to die because of the terrible things he had done to the woman. And he made the point that, in reverse, if a man murdered his wife, there would never be any case of his claiming that he murdered her because she was abusive to him. He made the point that a man who was physically abusive to his wife, she would be divorced. He would be paying her alimony for the rest of her life. If a
Mhm.
woman was physically abusive to her husband,
Hmm.
there was there was nothing the man could do about it. Even if she set him on fire or, drove over him in her carriage, he could go to the police. He would likely be laughed at. She might be
Mhm.
fined, and he would have to
Right.
pay the fine because, of course, he
Yeah.
was responsible for paying her debts. So he goes through and he talks about the fact that at every stage of the legal process, the woman was treated with far more generosity,
Mm.
empathy, and pity than any man. And whether it was had to do with whether she was charged in the first place, whether she would be convicted of the crime, how she would be represented in court, what kind of sentence she would receive, how she would be treated in prison, all those types of things. So the inability to take seriously women's criminality, women's violence, women's propensity for cruelty or dishonesty, the inability to take that very seriously, he claimed was a primary feature of 19th century
Mm.
British society and Western society in general. And it seems, I would argue, that that is still the case today. So our belief that there was this time in the relatively recent
Mm.
past when women were harshly treated and that now, things have changed somewhat for the better. No, I think it's true, if at least if Bax is telling the truth, and he was a barrister. Nobody has come forward to say he was lying in his book. He wrote a later book, by the way, called The Fraud of Feminism, published in 1913, elaborating on some of the same ideas. The greater
Mhm.
empathy that we tend to have for women has been a feature of Western
Mhm.
societies for some centuries at least. And I think feminism capitalized on that and it exacerbates it. There's a study by a woman named Sonia Starr, who is a professor of criminology, came out in 2012, I believe. And she did an extensive study
Mhm.
of what she called gender disparities in criminal sentencing. And she found the exact same thing that Bax argued was the case, a century earlier, that women receive sentences for the same crimes. If you sort
Mhm.
of try to work out a crime with the same degree of violence involved, the same degree of forethought, the same degree of malice. She found that women received sentences that were on average 63% less harsh than those that men received. And she said, again, all through, women are far less likely to be charged. If charged, they're far less likely to be convicted than men. If convicted, they're far more likely to have a
Mhm.
suspended sentence, which they serve, in the community rather than serve time in jail. They're far more likely to be exonerated. They're far more likely to be
Yeah.
have their criminal conviction overturned. Like at every stage
And that
of the
was
legal
across the
process,
Western world,
there's
or
there's
in the
that greater
US?
empathy. So well, she was looking at the U.S., but it's certainly
Mm.
true in Canada as well from all the research that I've done, and I suspect it's true in the Western world, but I couldn't say for sure. But the fact that men are
Mhm.
95%
Yeah.
of the prison population, that is quite astounding. And again, we see the sort of internal contradictions in general feminist thinking on a subject like this. If you ask a feminist, why are most Nobel Prizes
Mhm.
awarded to men?
Yeah.
They'll say, well, it's because there's gender bias, right? That's
Yeah.
why. It's not because men have done more great things that deserve the Nobel Prizes, just clear gender bias.
Mm.
But if you say to
Yeah.
them, why are there more
Men.
men in prison?
Right.
Ah,
Mhm.
right. That's because more men commit crime. So sometimes there's gender bias when it's a case that a woman wants to point out that women have been discriminated against. But
Right.
sometimes it's just a case of men do bad things. And when men do bad things, is because men do bad things. Men are bad. When women
Yeah,
do
the
bad
hypocrisy,
things, it's
that
because
strikes
women are
me as
victims
well.
of men. And
Mm.
yeah, I mean, I find that, yeah, so startling. If you put into a Google search attempts to keep women out of prison, you'll find all sorts of articles and programs. I found some in the United Kingdom, certainly in Canada and the United States,
Mhm.
saying that we should try to keep women out of prison. Why? Well, because when women commit crime, it's usually because they were abused as children, They were led into their life of crime by a man. In some way, they were influenced to do what they did because of a man, or they were abused by the man, so they were acting in response to that. They had childhoods, or their youth was one of deprivation or addiction or mental illness. And okay, I
Mhm.
agree. Probably that is the case
Mm.
in at least many instances, but it's also true for men. Men usually don't just decide one day, "Hey, I'm gonna become a criminal." Some do, I'm sure, but, most also had childhoods of deprivation. Most also suffer from mental illness, addiction, stress, all sorts of problems in their lives that led them to become criminal, violent fathers or
Mhm.
violent mothers, indeed, or they were fatherless. So, again, it's
Right.
this lack of empathy on men, and just in general, that is how our society
Right.
is.